Marcuse says explicitly that the working class has, because of the success of the capitalism that he decries, become conservative, even counter-revolutionary. And so Marxism, at the end of the 1960s, spun on its heel and betrayed the tokens in the working class that it had been lying and holding up for 100 years. It never cared about the working class. They were Marx's excuse to say, I'm one of you, give me your stuff. And in the 1960s, the mask dropped. Capitalism works. We can't trust the working class to be our revolutionary cadre. We're going to turn on them. And Marcuse says, well, where is the revolutionary energy? That's where we're going to go. And he identifies, in his words, which are not quite couth by 2022 standards, so we could maybe cancel him, except he's a communist, and you don't cancel communists because that's a one-way street. In his words, you find that energy in the ghetto population. You find that energy in the sexual minorities, in the feminists, in the unemployed, in the outsiders, and the radicals. But it's hard to get theory to him. He doesn't come quite out and say that the ghetto population is too stupid to learn Marxist theory, but he skates around that. He says that we have to radicalize the students. We teach the students in the colleges and the universities to be radicals. And we get them to teach the theory to these radical organizations that are rising up within those populations, the Black Panthers, the Black Nationalists, the Black Liberationists, within the so-called ghetto populations, the radical feminists, the nascent gay, which became queer movement. You agitate those people and feed them Marxist theory, and meanwhile you infiltrate the universities and you start to do the thing. If you're going to major in computer science, you do computer science as a Marxist. Then you get a job in some place that does computer science and you bring your Marxism and those politics to the office and you start filling your office politics with Marxism. If you're going to study biology, you study biology. You become a biologist, but you also study Marxism on the side. And you go to your lab and you go to your graduate school and you bring the Marxism there as well. And inch by inch by inch, by taking over the colleges and universities, especially the colleges of education, this is him writing in 1972 actually, you can fill every sector of society with committed Marxists, with people committed to the liberated revolution, to the emancipation of man. Finally, to the utopian dream that the working class has turned on. Now there's a certain upside if you are a Marxist to abandoning the working class. It's that you can all of a sudden align with the people who are funding you all along, which are big corporate interests, like the Rockefellers. You don't have to pretend anymore that you're poor. You can just sign up with the big banks and the big corporations. And you can get them to become, you might even name one of the banks Vanguard, who knows? You might get them to become the Leninist vanguard that's going to push the theory through society on behalf of the stupid working class that became conservative and wouldn't do it. How convenient. You have no obligation to the worker any longer when you've shifted out of tokenizing the working class. So instead you tokenize identity politics and you get the corporations to take up identity politics, but not identity politics by the standards that you might assume from the civil rights movement. By the way, if you didn't know, the term identity politics was coined by Marxists in 1977. It was not something that Martin Luther King, who died in 1968, ever had on his mind. It's not the same thing. Identity politics is not the civil rights movement. It is identity Marxism. It is taking that same Marxist engine and applying it to identity factors. So you might invent, as in 1993 Cheryl Harris did, a special kind of property called whiteness. She wrote a paper that's considered a foundational text of critical race theory called Whiteness as Property. She describes it as a form of bourgeois cultural property. And now you have a special kind of property that some people have access to and other people are excluded from, with a long history in the United States, whether that's Jim Crow and segregation, whether that's slavery before that you can point to and say this entire system was created by white people with an ideology of white supremacy to maintain their grip on power over everybody else. And voila, you have a Marxist theory of race. They call it critical race theory. You can say, well, what we have to do is we have to raise a racial consciousness in this racial underclass called people of color, who are excluded from whiteness by virtue of their skin color. that racial consciousness will make them into anti-racists. And then you can read what Ibram Kendi has to say about anti-racism. In 2019, he published a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's a terrible book. I recommend you read it. On page 19, he tells you what it means to be an anti-racist. He says that the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. So being an anti-racist means discriminating in a way that produces, according to Kendi, equity. What is equity? Equity is the collection and redistribution of shares in the cultural and material economy such that citizens or groups are made equal. That's the definition of equity. What is the definition of socialism? It is the collection of the shares of material production and redistributed so that citizens and groups are made equal. Huh. Isn't that funny? Equity means socialism. It's just a new name. I'm telling you, it's like it put on a dress. Wait, that's queer theory. We'll get to that. So what did Kendi say? Also in 2019, he was invited to write an article for Politico magazine, How to Solve Inequality. Now that's a pretty big topic. You think you could write some books about how you might take on inequality. In fact, there might be libraries worth of books on the question of inequality going back hundreds of years. Kendi had a single paragraph. He wrote one whole paragraph, How to Solve Inequality, pass an anti-racist constitutional amendment. The first thing this constitutional amendment will do will enshrine a single principle. By the way, he misspelled principle in his one paragraph essay on how to solve inequality. That principle is going to be, very simply, anytime racial inequity, so differences on average by group where white people come out on top of anybody else, but not otherwise, because Asians are white now because they did better. Anytime racial inequity surfaces, the explanation will be discrimination. In other words, we're now going to have a ministry of truth, which they're actually creating now separately, that says that the answer to racial differences in outcomes is always discrimination. It will then also create a Department of Anti-Racism as a fourth branch of government. The Department of Anti-Racism, which by the way has the letters DOA, which is kind of funny. The Department of Anti-Racism will be empowered to pre-clear all local, state, and federal public policy to ensure that racist outcomes are not going to occur from them. It has the power to monitor public officials to make sure that they don't express racist ideas. It has the power to monitor private institutions and their officials to make sure that racist outcomes do not occur. And it will be empowered to punish public officials and private entities who don't voluntarily change their racist ideas. Does that sound like a dictatorship to you? DOA, Dictatorship of the Anti-Racists. You thought I was going to say dead on arrival. It's both. It's both. So dictatorship of the anti-racists in perfect parallel to the dictatorship of the proletariat. So critical race theory is just Marxism reinvented. Queer theory, same thing. This gender stuff that they're doing to your kids, same thing. Certain people get to be normal, other people don't get to be normal. That's like a special kind of bourgeois property. So what do? Well, we have to abolish the idea of being normal. You have to assault the idea of normalcy itself using a Marxist conflict theory. The outsiders have to be elevated and brought to the center. Why do they have to be brought to the center from the margin? Because that's where the power is. They say so explicitly. The goal of queer theory, in their own words, is explicitly not to create stable LGBTQ identities. That's a quote. It is instead to make sure that those identities remain fluid so they never become stable. And we could do this with education, we could do this with climate change, we could do this with the masks with COVID, we could do it with other COVID policy like those vaccines, we could do it with anything you want, and it's a Marxist theory of a Marxist theory and a Marxist theory. You have a special kind of property called natural immunity. You have a special kind of property called energy independence. We can just do this again and again and again. The word that they use for this is that the theory went kaleidoscopic. I'm not kidding. Kaleidoscopic consciousness is the idea of Jose Medina. He's an education theorist in 2013, and he said that's the goal education should adopt, is to raise a kaleidoscopic consciousness, a Marxist consciousness with all these different colorful dimensions, whether it's race, sex, gender, sexuality, ability status, fat status, mental health status, climate change, vaccine status, mask status, whatever you want. It's a Marxist theory that has infiltrated literally every dimension of public policy from our friends at the Democrats and about half the Republicans. So that's what is happening in the world, and I'm seeing that maybe the shepherd's hook's coming, so I'll tell you how it works, and that's Mao Zedong. That's Mao Zedong. So Marx was the what, Lenin was the first how, and that was a bloody revolution over peasants. Stalin was the second how. That went badly. Mao was the third how. He perfected a technique called cultural revolution. The leading education theorist in Marxist thought, who is the leading education theorist in North America now, Paulo Freire, said that the entire point of education is to produce a perpetual cultural revolution. He says that explicitly in his book, The Politics of Education, published in 1985, which was the book that led him to be accepted in North American colleges of education virtually universally, where he's now the third most cited author in the social sciences and humanities period. Our South American friends can probably tell you what a shit show Paulo Freire's education program is. It doesn't work. Its goal is to make your kids Marxist. But it's not good enough. It's not just the Freirean education that your kids are dealing with. They have this other program that's kind of based in it called social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is like a hypodermic needle for injecting those identity theories. And why on earth would you want to use identity theories to create a cultural revolution? Because that's what Mao Zedong did. And it worked. Mao separated the polity into 10 identity categories. Doesn't that sound familiar? Some of those are good identities. They were red for communism. Some of them were bad. They were black for fascism. The black identities, just as a matter of curiosity, were rich farmer, landlord, counter-revolutionary, bad influence, and right wing. Oh, there we go. We've got a full-blown representative here. The good identities were peasant, laborer. You can't exactly easily become those except by force. And then revolutionary cadres, revolutionary units, and revolutionary martyrs. In other words, radical activists. So what did they do? If we have somebody who's all of those or one of those, you bully their kids at school. You mistreat their kids at school because they have a black identity by association. You tell them to rat out their parents and we'll make you a revolutionary. You have a good identity. We'll treat you better at school. We'll give you special lunch. We'll give you a neat little uniform. We'll let you have special privileges. Maybe you get 2 recesses. Rat out your parents. Shame them. Drag them out into public. Go to the temple. Tear down and destroy the old elements of culture. Destroy the 4 olds. That was Mao's order. The Suju in Mandarin. Destroy them. Old culture, old customs, old habits, old ways of thinking. Destroy them. Shame your parents, shame your teachers, shame your uncles, shame your friends, anybody who's not on board. And what do we do today? Well, if you happen to be born with white skin, you were born into a system of whiteness that you didn't even know that you benefit from, and you uphold it by your very benefit. You're kind of the worst kind of person. That's a quote from a 7-year-old who went through one of these diversity trainings at school. I'm the worst kind of person. People who look like me did the worst stuff in history. And what can you do? Well, you can become an ally. That's a red identity. You can be in solidarity with the movement. You can march for Black Lives Matter. But it's not going to be good enough because you're actually just positioning yourself as a good white. That's the term. You're just making yourself look better. You're not actually trying to become a true anti-racist or an ally. You're just trying to benefit yourself. But did you know that there are like 200 genders and like 200 sexualities and that you could socially transition here at school? And you could become politically queer. So now you have an army of young white girls, especially, not only, who are already self-conscious, going through the problems that it is to be a young girl growing up, who are being told that if they get a double mastectomy, they're interesting again. And you see a 4,000% increase in 2 years in the rate of young girls identifying as trans. And you have an entire grooming ideology in the schools called affirmative care to usher them through social transition at school. And why? Because that will destroy the 4 olds. Another Marxist that you probably have not heard of by the name of George Lukács, that's the Hungarian pronunciation of George, if you're trying to figure out how to look him up. George Lukács realized in the 1910s that if you sexualize children, you can effect a communist revolution more effectively than any other way. Turns out the Hungarians didn't like this one damn bit, and after 4 months after their Soviet revolution that succeeded, they pushed his ass right out of power. But in the meantime, he laid down a roadmap for future communists. If you sexualize the children, what will they do? They'll go home and they'll tell their parents, you don't understand me. Things are different now. They'll reject the advice of their parents. They will say their parents are oppressing them. They're not affirming me. I was talking today, actually, with Erica. I was speaking with Erica in the car on the way back from the earlier event, and I told her, my stepdaughter, when she was 14 years old, decided that she was in love with some Christian boy at some church, like an hour and a half away from our house. We were like, we're not taking you to that church. It's an hour and a half away. There are 9 churches on our street. You can go to any of them. I live in the South. And she said we were oppressing her, and she went to the school, and she told the counselor at the school that we are possessed by demons, and that we're satanic, and that we're terrible people. And we actually had to deal with the guidance counselor who was interested in possibly getting Child Protective Services involved, because we weren't affirming her desire to go out with a boy who lived an hour and a half away at 14 years old, because we wouldn't drive her up to the church every week. This is the affirming attitude that 14-year-old girls want, but now it's about their sex, gender, sexuality. So you don't understand me, Dad. It's different now, Mom. And you cut the kid off from their family. You might even literally lead to them calling Child Protective Services to take them away from their parents. They're grooming them into that too. Look up the story of Yaeli Galdamez from California if you don't know it. Y-A-E-L-I, and you can spell Galdamez because it's a phonetic language. Yaeli Galdamez is a perfect example. They groomed her, they socially transitioned her. Her Peruvian mother didn't speak very much English. They trained her to tell the CPS officer, the Child Protective Service officer, that she wasn't getting the affirming care at home. They took her out of the home. That was at 16 years old. She decided she was a boy, and at 19 she walked in front of a train and killed herself. This is a story that should be told in Spanish language everywhere right now, because a lot of Latinos in this country have no idea what's happening because of that language barrier to their children by Marxists who know to sexualize them. But you don't just cut kids off from their family. You say, but the Bible says we were made man and woman, blah, 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 whatever it says about that. We can go into Genesis or whatever. We can go into Leviticus if you want. We can get hardcore. Obsolete. Obsolete. That's a book of oppression. That's exactly what Marx said about it. It's just part of the story the people in power tell themselves. It's just not American. American culture is obsolete. We got to get rid of it. You can cut a kid off from their family, their religion, their culture, and their nation, 4 olds, in one go by sexualizing children and unleashing them as they go through the terrible parts of puberty. And you can create a pump to do that for these kids that will lead them from one direction to the other by demonizing their race, demonizing something to do with their skin color, demonizing the way that they engage in politics around that, and then pumping them into the sexual transition phases as an answer so that they can have some more successful feeling. Black identity to red identity. Maoism is what's happening to your children under the brand name of the psychological abuse technique called transformative social emotional learning, which is the same transformative where Marx said that the order is to transform the world. That's what's happening in this state here in Vermont. That's what's happening in the reddest of red states like Oklahoma, in Idaho, in Utah, where the governor goes by his pronouns, as it turns out, to kind of warm up the next speaker. Governor Spencer Cox, he, him, Republican of super red Utah. It's what's happening in all 50 states. It's what's being dangled as Common Core 2.0 as a requirement to introduce this if you want federal education money in your state to the tune of billions of dollars. This is what's happening. Marxism is the what, Maoism and its destruction is the how. That is why if you want to keep this republic, you have to do something. What do you do? People ask me all the time, James, what do I do? And I say, I don't know, what can you do? I don't know, what can you do? You first of all need to be hopeful. You need to believe that the Constitution can prevail. You need to believe that the Republic can prevail. You need to believe that the communities that you are in are filled with good people with whom you can connect and prevail, even here in super annoying progressive Vermont. You need to start taking up. Many of you are running for office for the first time. Some of you are running for office for not the first time. Some of you are in office. Some of you are thinking about going for school boards. That's something to do. Some of you can support their campaigns. Some of you can show up. Some of you can knock doors. Some of you can make signs. There are all kinds of things you can do to support getting the right people in office and getting the wrong people out of office. You can go to those neighbors around Vermont that I keep hearing about who every time you talk to them they say conservative stuff but they don't show up to vote for anything. These are things you can do. You can run the bake sale to help them make money. You can support Organizations like Ellie's that are bringing people in to speak to you about this, to educate you about this, to get you equipped and fired up to want to do something about it. If there's anything that you can do, that you can think of to do. You can bind together as parents. Utah has an organization called Utah Parents United, where in less than a year they got 70,000 parents and grandparents willing to stand up, share resources, support one another, show up to school board meetings, show up for candidates, vet candidates, and do all kinds of things throughout the entire state of Utah. Vermont can do the same thing. Utah doesn't have very many people. I think 70,000 is like 94% of them. You can definitely do it here too. That's a joke on Utah's expense. I think they actually have 3 million. I think 70,000 is still a sizable number of people. So let me encourage you. This is the time. We have one shot. That's what Rowan told me earlier. That's why he's got to vote. That's why he's got to be a citizen. We got one shot right now to stop tyranny. If they don't get the United States, they're not going to get it. They're not going to get global communism. The United States will rise up. The American right will slowly, a little too late, show up and do the job, do the right thing. But that depends on you being willing to wake up and do the right thing. That's our moment in history. I encourage you all to take it up. And so with that, I actually get the special honor, I made Ellie wait a long time on this, to honor a Vermonter by the name of Elizabeth Cady. I just learned about her recently. Hero with Valor Under Fire is what she is being credited with. It says EWSD. I leave it to you, Vermonters, to decode that acronym for me. School Board 2021-2022. Her story is really a story that you should be paying attention to. I don't know the details tremendously. I don't want to misspeak and overspeak, but I will say that it was actually something that I was glad to hear. This woman saw that things were wrong in her community. She stood up to the mob. She got on the school board. She called out the critical race theory, and she was subjected to some of the most vicious, slanderous attacks that anybody would ever go through, to the point where she was finally forced to resign and may even have to leave the community because she's been so viciously attacked. That's the kind of courage that you all need to have. That's the kind of courage where she needs a support network around her so that she can fight these fights and continue these fights. This is why you all have to start coming together. You need to find each other of like mind or of suspicious mind that something might be going wrong in this country and start banding together to talk about these issues and support one another so that heroes like Liz have the support they need to fight these fights and keep fighting these fights and change Vermont, to make a difference, even here in cobalt blue Vermont, which can and will remember that it has solid, rock solid American red, white, and blue values underneath a veneer painted by the media. So thank you for having me come to Vermont. Thank you for standing up in the worst of conditions, except maybe California. Thank you for everything you all are doing. I appreciate it.
Community. Really, Essex has been ground zero in this state. They're the ones that early on were being exposed to the educational program and putting together the lesson plans. I'm not thinking about that. And this was being embedded into their schools by some very, very active personnel. And Liz saw it early on, and she engaged her community, and she was elected to their school board. But the process was already well entrenched, and the president of their board ended up being maneuvered into being now the president of the State Board of Education, where she could have authority to be able to embed into all the state standards the CRT content language. So Liz was there as our favorite trying to fight the right. And it's because of that, we're honoring her with this plaque, and Ellie is one of the key people that helped support her and So on behalf of the Save UWSD, we would like to share this with Ellie and the flowers as well. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think everybody has said a lot about Liz Cady already. I heard a saying the other day, and it was, anyone who thinks that they're too small to do something hasn't spent the night with a single, slept through the night with a single mosquito in their room. And I think that Liz understood that. She was very, a really strong, mighty person. I'm in the school district where she became the school member of. My children are out of school now, but she really stepped up and she showed a lot of courage. And I was asked to accept this honor for her since she could not be here. So, thank you.
Thank you. Beautiful. Beautiful. And do we love James, Lindsay?
I do.
And guess what, folks? Come August, a friend of James, Carol Swain, is going to be here with us. And how about James, too?
I'd love to come back.
More syrup, maple syrup, everybody.
Yes.
Everybody.
Shall we bring James back in August?
And by the way, John Farr was really instrumental in being
My pleasure. You guys are awesome.
We love you all. So, thank you. I tell you, it's tough to shut you off, and people. I want to keep him. I want to keep him here. Do you want to stay over another day? Because anyway.
We can't let him go without a present.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh! You know, I was
All
talking.
about the media. We got to get all this stuff in the media anyway. So we know you can't take back syrup because you're flying. But next time we'll ship with the syrup.
Yeah, I'll bring it back.
And I have, I have copies of James' book, $20. So, I think.
Donated one in the auction, our silent auction. I want to thank Dr. Lindsay for putting one of his books up there that we can bid on. Somebody can take it home tonight, along with
Excellent.
a lot of the other things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And thank you,
I'll sign it too if you want.
That's great. And thank you to Jerry Malloy, too, for his military background. And thank all the people here who served our country. And one of the items in the silent auction is a little key ring that has a Purple Heart thing in it, like a Purple Heart medal. It's one of the items that's part of our Freedom Package, so check it out.
You taking that home to your wife?
Yes, that's exactly what's going to happen.
Thank you, Sue. So,
Have you ever worried about
You
being
know-
canceled?
you know, we're running late, but y'all are not happy, not unhappy, right? You really didn't want me to shut him off, and you're not going to want me to shut off Professor Meriwether either. So we're going to start off introducing you to Professor Meriwether with a film that was created for him. And come on up, Professor, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that this film was created by his attorneys. And he'll tell you more about that. But that's going to be the way we're going to introduce him.
Okay.
All right? Is that good? Thank you.
Roll.
Have you ever worried about being canceled? Losing your job because of standing up for what you believe? It nearly happened to me, but I'm still standing. My name is Dr. Nicholas Meriwether. For over 20 years, I've had the joy of serving as a philosophy professor at Shawnee State University in Portsmouth, Ohio. During that time, I focused my scholarship and teaching on the intersection of philosophy, ethics, religion, and political theory. When I began teaching my political philosophy class in the spring of 2018, I had no idea the first day's discussion would bring me to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, but it did. On that day, a male student raised his hand, and I responded with a simple, "Yes, sir." I refer to my students as sir or ma'am or by a title, Mr. or Miss, for example, and their last name. The formality fosters an atmosphere of seriousness, mutual respect, and courtesy. And I've always referred to students based on their biological sex. After all, that is who they are. After class, the student approached me, identified himself as a woman, and insisted that I refer to him as such, using feminine terms. When I expressed reservations about his demands, the student became belligerent, got in my face, and began circling around me to intimidate me. Swearing at me, he promised to get me fired if I didn't instantly agree to his demands. Within days, I offered to accommodate him. I was willing to use any name he preferred, and I was also willing to simply drop sir, ma'am, and other sex-specific titles for him. I had hoped that university administrators would understand my position, even if some disagreed with it. At first, they agreed that I had struck the right balance. After all, I was willing to avoid using a pronoun that offended my student. So why would they force me to use a pronoun that offends my conscience? But that wasn't enough to satisfy the student, and the university soon reversed its position. Officials now insisted that I either use identity-based terms, including recently concocted pronouns like zir and z, for all students, or eliminate all sex-referencing terms from my vocabulary at all times. This would have required me to speak English as it has never been spoken in the history of the language. If I didn't agree to abide by the university's coercive demand, I faced punishment that could end my career. And even if I did, every slip-up would become grounds for complaints, intrusive investigations, and punishment. Sure enough, when I did not accept these demands, the university punished me and rejected my appeal. This is what we have come to expect from cancel culture, a zero-sum game where only complete submission can be accepted. No compromise, no free speech, no efforts for mutual respect. So with the help of Alliance Defending Freedom, I filed a lawsuit to defend my rights and protect the job I love. I felt confident that in a country in which schools cannot force students to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, courts would recognize that universities cannot force professors to say things we do not believe, especially when they are so self-evidently false. This is why I was greatly disheartened when the district court ruled against me on every point, throwing out my case. But we appealed, and after more than 2 years of litigation, the Sixth Circuit rightly recognized the university's demands as an assault on the First Amendment freedoms of faculty members. The court wrote, "If professors lacked free speech protections when teaching, a university would wield alarming power to compel ideological conformity. A university president could require a pacifist to declare that war is just, a civil rights icon to condemn the freedom riders, a believer to deny the existence of God, or a Soviet emigre to address his students as comrades. That cannot be." Exactly. Professors in public universities cannot be coerced into endorsing an ideology we reject. Before our current cancel culture era, this would have been as obvious as any truism in higher education or American society, including men can't be pregnant. This was never just about a pronoun. It's about what that pronoun communicates. It's about being forced to endorse an ideology. Tolerance is a two-way street. A university classroom is not an assembly line for one type of thought. Students, and more importantly, administrators, must learn to accept that the freedom to disagree is part and parcel of living in a free society, and they need to do so before it's too late. Find out more about cases like mine at adflegal.org. You can also find more videos like this on Alliance Defending Freedom's YouTube channel, Facebook page, and at adflegal.org/Freedom Matters. Let me just say that after listening to James, I kind of feel like Gerald Ford felt after he followed Ronald Reagan, or a comedian that has to follow Dave Chappelle. Wow, who lined this up? Anyway, I do have a couple of things I want to kind of try to tie in with James. That was an amazing talk. I do think we have to distinguish between the marks and the smarts. The smarts are the people who are behind the ideology. They are the planners, they are the executors, they are the activists. But there are a lot of marks. These are people who are confused. They're not sure what to think. They can actually be convinced either way. We have to be aware of who we're dealing with. So what I'm going to talk to you tonight about is how we might address the people who just think, well, why are you such a jerk that you can't use these pronouns? I am still getting that even from faculty members, and I don't know in many cases whether I'm talking to a mark or to a smart, and sometimes you are not going to know. So what I want to do is I'm going to give you the responses that I wrote to what I thought would be the most obvious questions. How much time do I have, Ellie? I'm out of time, I'm sorry. Well, tomorrow.
I don't want to miss a word.
Oh, okay, so, is that better? Okay. So anyway, these are the responses that I thought about giving to people